Nancy sort of began to introduce things last week, and so we had a chance to look at how the Pentateuch was used last week in the different Gospels. This week we're going to be looking at the prophets and how the different Gospel writers use the prophetic writings from our Old Testament, from the Hebrew Bible, and then next week we'll be back and looking at how some of the different writings are used in these Gospels, things like Psalms and some of those sorts of books. I will just simply name that I have not even begun to scratch the surface or get close to using every single citation, but I wanted to be able to have us out by 9 o'clock tonight. So I picked and chose selectively, although really I'm pretty sure we'll be out by 8 if all goes well. So just kind of just to sort of note the when we say that we're talking about prophets, when we're talking about the prophetic books, these books here on the screen, this is what we're talking about. And so you've got kind of one group, which particularly in Christianity, we look at the major prophets, including Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel. Now I put Daniel as an asterisk because Daniel is actually included in a section called other books, or also included in the writings. So I kind of asterisked that because we really do tend to look at Daniel as a prophet. And then you've got the minor prophets: Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. And now that I've said them all correctly, now I can mess them up throughout the rest of our time tonight. But really, those are minor prophets, mostly because they tend to be very short. They tend to be short books. And even in the Tanakh, they're looked at as a single book with kind of the 12 sections within that one book. So, we do look at them in that term, not major and minor in terms of importance, major and minor more in terms of how much content they have provided us in their writing. In the Gospels, and talking specifically about the Gospels right now, you can see here the books that are in bold and italics. Those are the books that the Gospels have cited, the prophetic books that the Gospels use in different places. The other books, most of the other books are included, are used throughout the New Testament. Everyone except for Obadiah. And I don't know what Obadiah did to draw the ire of the New Testament writers, but Obadiah was left out of the New Testament and is the only one of the prophetic books to not be included in the Christian scriptures, or cited, I guess, in the Christian scriptures. And interestingly, it's a book that is only 21 verses long. The whole of Obadiah is just 21 verses, which is the third shortest book in the Bible, if you're looking for trivia, with 2nd John being the shortest. But we don't need to quite go into that sort of thing tonight. So before I kind of give my own thoughts, is there anyone who wants to offer up? And I know I think people are muted at the moment, but we can allow people to unmute. What is a prophet? And I'm asking all of you, what do you think a prophet is?
Someone who comments on society and the times.
Okay. What else do we have?
That was between.
I think they speak to the future of what is to come.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Anything else?
I always put it, speak truth to power.
Mm.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think all of these are really good and are important, pieces for us to keep in mind. Just a couple of the things that I have, they function really as an intermediary between God and the people. Often as a messenger, sort of, receiving and interpreting things, from God and offering them to the people, but also will oftentimes carry concerns and intercessions back to God and bring those concerns back to God. If we look at the word prophet, it, kind of different ways that it can be used, and kind of slightly different variations. They are sometimes thought of, as one who is called, as a seer, a visionary, or a holy man or a holy woman. And so these are kind of the different pieces that you might see, or you might hear a prophet kind of being referred to. One of the things that, to keep in mind, though, is that a prophet is not really somebody who is predicting the future, not trying to offer up, this is exactly what's going to happen. I try to think of them a little bit more as, they point towards where things may be headed. They don't point to a specific thing necessarily to an exact event, but they point towards the sort of things that could be expected if a person or if a people continue the way that they are going. They then the prophet might talk about, well, you'll begin to see all sorts of negative things happening and dangerous things happening, but if you change your ways, then it will, then things can become good. And they're offering more of that kind of a warning, either a warning or sometimes even a beacon of hope, a little bit more than a specific prediction, is one thing for us to try and keep in mind as we move through. So for the Gospels, looking specifically at the Gospels, there are basically two main subjects for that the prophets are used for, that the gospel writers used the prophets to help talk about. And really the main one is pretty easy for us to guess. And that would be the Messiah. And the coming Messiah, what the Messiah is expected to be, who the Messiah might be, what that Messiah might do. And really that's the bulk of the prophetic use or the use of the prophets throughout the Gospels, is talking about the Messiah, and particularly for us as Christians, talking about how Jesus fits into that Messiah narrative, those Messiah expectations. There is another section. It's often called the little apocalypse. It's about a chapter long, and all three, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, essentially use the same references. Most likely Mark had gone and offered this little apocalypse. It's one chapter in each of these. Most likely Mark had written that, and then both Matthew and Luke chose to include it, as they often did, almost word for word, almost verbatim, in their own versions of the gospel. But really, when they are using the prophets to talk about the Messiah and how Jesus fits into that narrative, they're going to be looking at where the Messiah is going to be born, where the Messiah will live and grow up. even how that Messiah will be treated, and even some of the specifics, how the Messiah will enter the Holy Land, die, and even just a little bit about resurrection as well. At least we Christians read it as resurrection. Is going to be a piece of that. But we will take a little bit of time to at least look at these more apocalyptic prophecies, these sort of talking about how how the known world may come to a close. And you can see here in both Matthew and Daniel, starting with Matthew. So when you see the desolating sacrilege standing in the holy place, as was spoken of by the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand. Then those in Judea must flee to the mountains. And you can see the sort of reference that Matthew is using out of Daniel, where Daniel writes, he shall make a strong covenant with many for 1 week, and for half of the week he shall make sacrifice and offering cease. And in their place shall be an abomination that desolates until the decreed end is poured out upon the desolator. Really lovely, kind of generous sort of sounding things here. But really, the desolating sacrilege, really particularly for Daniel, as Daniel is thinking about the worship that the people of Israel offer up, the sacrilege, this desolating sacrilege for Daniel's writing is really using the temple for non-Jewish observance, non-Jewish religious observance or practices, especially incidences of idolatry or unclean sacrifice in the temple. So you can sort of see how that's being talked about here, but using some of that very similar, using some of that very similar language. And then even Luke, also has Jesus speaking about that same desolating sacrilege. But when you see the desolating sacrilege set up where it ought not to be, so he's using that same idea, using the way that the temple may become profaned by the things that happen within it, by sacrifices that ought not to be offered up, by idolatry that may take place. These are things that are taking place. And if you remember, for Matthew and for Luke, the idea of the temple, the idea of the temple not lasting is very much in their minds. As they are writing, with the temple destruction still very, very close in their minds. And even Mark is, as Mark is writing and including some of these as well, I just didn't cite it. Mark is seeing some of what is happening around and knowing what might be coming, recognizing what might be coming. And even himself, probably seeing some of these practices, these desolating sacrileges, showing up and recognizing that this could now be, for the people of Israel, this is the end of their, kind of in that sense, the end of their world as the temple would come down. For the Christians of that time, they're also, watching the tensions rise throughout Jerusalem and seeing the city taken over and seeing the temple being torn down. It's still very, very much of what they are understanding going on in the world around them. But we can kind of go on and even see a little bit more as Matthew continues later, a little bit later in his chapter. Immediately after the suffering of those days, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give light. The stars fall from heaven and the powers of heaven will be shaken. Then the Son of Man will appear in heaven, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to another. And really now Matthew is talking and using this sort of speech by Jesus to talk about to talk about the coming of the Son of Man, and Jesus sort of offering up, this is what, Matthew is having Jesus offer up these words. This is what you are seeing happening around right now. This is what you're seeing going on as I am here with you. And you can find here that he's echoing very much Isaiah. For the stars of the heavens and their constellations will not give their light. The sun will be dark at its rising, and the moon will not shed its light. And then Daniel, continuing on with Daniel, as I watched in the night visions, I saw one like a human being coming with the clouds of heaven, and he came to the Ancient One and was presented before him. And so you've got some of this sort of imagery, you've got some of this kind of conversation going on. Again, in the Gospels, this is Jesus talking, this is Jesus speaking right now. But you can see how the words that are being used, the words that Jesus is offering here, they harken back to how if we think back to some of the if we think back to some of the narratives around the birth of the Son of Man, the birth of the Messiah, you can begin to see how a human being coming with the clouds of heaven, and presented before God. We remember the angels there, the angels singing of Jesus' birth, and you can begin to hear and see some of that imagery kind of showing up and using this imagery from these ancient scriptures to try and talk about who Jesus is in that present time. And even then, continuing on for the gospel writers, they also had, Jesus is talking here, just as himself, but they also know, they also have in their minds and in their writings the idea of Jesus' ascent into heaven, after the 50 days of Easter and ascending in. And so you can see again some of that same imagery about the ascending into the clouds, and then his promise of returning at another time, returning to come and to bring judgment at a later time. I think there we are. Okay. So I think I got one of my slides out of place on my printout. There we go. So one of the especially in Luke's gospel, and I don't remember specifically where Matthew's gospel holds this, but in Luke's gospel, Jesus offers up this vision of the end of the end times. He offers this up shortly after he's driven out the money changers in the temple. After he's overturned the tables and driven everybody out. At the time, a very prophetic sort of prophetic demonstration at that point. It's also shortly after his triumphal entry. So the triumphal entry, the Palm Sunday pomp and circumstance, is just a couple of days old at this point. And so to have to think about that sort of context as well, that Jesus is saying the end of all of what you see here is coming. For him, he is beginning to talk about it in a much more immediate sort of sense. But you can see here where both Ezekiel and Luke, they have that same imagery, and the same imagery we see back here in Isaiah. I know I had you reading something and then I switched the screen on you all. Sorry. but it's got again some of that very similar imagery. But then you bring Ezekiel in, when Ezekiel saying, when I blot you out, blotting out the people, Ezekiel is sort of talking about here. Covering the heavens, making the stars dark, covering the sun and the moon, not giving light. I will darken above, the heavens I will darken above you, and darkness on your land, says the Lord God. And Luke saying as well, in those days after that suffering, the sun will be darkened, the moon not give its light, and stars falling from heaven. The powers in the heavens will be shaken. All that we know, all that we take comfort in, the sort of, the assurance that we have with the sun and the stars and the moon making their way across the skies each and every day, the comfort that can bring, if all of that is taken away, it is like the world has ended. If there is nothing familiar to be found, and nothing familiar to be found in looking around. And then just as a way to kind of draw at least this piece, at least this little section to kind of a quick close. The apocalyptic prophecies, the things that we were hearing, the stars being blocked out, or the sun being blocked, and the moon not giving any light. It's not intended, much like Revelation, it's not intended to be that sort of blow by blow account, of the ending of the world. But when we hear those sorts of words, when we hear those kinds of imagery about all of these things happening, it is easy to see it as a warning of great suffering, and not as a way to cause people to be fearful, but to cause people to recognize and to take seriously, the things, for the gospel writers, the things that Jesus has been saying, and how he is now setting the stage for, how Jesus and the gospel writers are now setting the stage for his crucifixion and all that's going to come with that. And how Jesus has been calling the people to repentance, and offering up the hope of redemption. All of this is now coming to a head for Jesus, and the gospel writers, as he is now days or even a day away from his own arrest and trial and crucifixion. It is now, that apocalyptic ending is now very much present. Is very, very much present for what is about to come. So that's just a quick kind of overview of those sort of apocalyptic prophecies, but really want to spend a little bit more of our time looking at the messianic prophecies, because that's really where we see most of the usage from the gospel writers of the prophetic books throughout the gospels. And sometimes it's in the sort of commentary that the gospel writers have throughout their books. Sometimes it is specifically coming out of the words of Jesus, or coming out of his mouth, or the mouth of some of those around him, but used in a number of different ways. But there are still a few things for us to think about. As people, as Christians, we certainly know and believe, and our faith tells us and teaches us that Jesus is that Messiah that was talked about, that was promised, that was hoped for. And yet that's not something that's not something that everybody agrees with. And so even as Christians, we need to contend with some of this, with some of what we're going to see here, and some of what is included throughout the Gospels, and even in pieces that weren't included in the Gospels, but that you can find in some of these Hebrew Bible books. We need to think about how closely these words are going to point to Jesus, and how much, error, for lack of a better word, how much error is acceptable. But really what we end up doing is we end up deciding, what do we do when there are discrepancies, when the Messiah in the Hebrew Bible is talked about in one way and Jesus shows up in another way? And how do we reconcile that kind of discrepancy? Because because he doesn't perfectly fulfill all of those, all of those pieces coming out of the prophets, and we'll see some of that. Some of it has to do with the way that we interpret the prophets, and we interpret the various prophecies that the prophecies that were offered up. And it really does become, sort of a matter of faith in who and what Jesus is. The prophecies, it's the idea, as I talked about before, the idea of the prophecies pointing towards the Messiah, pointing towards, from our viewpoint, Jesus, as opposed to describing Jesus perfectly or describing Jesus exactly. And so, so we'll touch on them as we get going through, but we really do need to keep these sort of questions in mind, just as a way to kind of remind us. I haven't really quoted Mark a whole lot, and you're not going to see me quoting Mark for the next little bit, because if we remember, Mark doesn't include anything about the birth narrative for Jesus. If you remember, Mark begins with John the Baptist, who has his own, sort of selection of prophecies and things that talk about, that we look at as talking about John the Baptist. But again, we're not going to be seeing any of Mark here either, because he really doesn't look at the birth narrative for Jesus. So beginning with kind of, and you'll see, I kind of look at the, some of the major sections of the messianic prophecies. I'll be looking at birth and where Jesus is to live. I'll be looking at some of these sort of major pieces, but you'll be able to see it clearly here on the screen. So the first question is, who will give birth to the Son of Man? Who will give birth to the Messiah? And Isaiah tells us, therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Look, the young woman is with child and shall bear a son and shall name him Emmanuel. And then Matthew, very similarly, all this took place to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet. Look, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall name him Emmanuel, which means God with us. And so right off the bat, in essentially the first prophecy we've got two differences here. We've got Isaiah talking about the young woman, and then Matthew taking that word in Hebrew that had meant young woman and changing it for it to read the virgin shall conceive and bear a son. Changing that word, does change the meaning of, does change the meaning of that piece of what Isaiah is saying. But then even the next piece, shall name him Emmanuel. And I love that Matthew includes it, that they shall name him Emmanuel, which means God is with us. And then we don't name Jesus Emmanuel. we name him Jesus. So again, this right here is, that's a significant difference that, for us to keep in mind. And we'll see here, and we'll see here, shortly. But if we remember, Jesus or Joseph is told by the angel shortly after, kind of in close order to this. Joseph is told in short order to name Jesus, or to name the child Jesus, which is the I think it's the Greek version of Joshua, and essentially means, is it one who saves? I think is what it is. I think I might have I think I accidentally, or not accidentally, I think I cut that slide. Oh no, there it is. It is the Greek form, yeah, it's the Greek form of Joshua, which means the Lord saves, or the Lord helps. So the Lord saves versus God with us is certainly a difference for us to think about, for us to have there. And then not just who will give birth, but then where the birth will happen. This actually, ends up coming a little bit more closely to what is offered from the prophets, where Micah writes, "But you, O Bethlehem of Ephrathah, who are one of the little clans of Judah, From you shall come forth for me one who is to rule in Israel, whose origin is from of old, from ancient days. So Micah, offering up that the Son of Man is going to come out of that clan, and out of that clan, out of that city, and Matthew here and here, this is where the chief priests are now talking to Herod. Herod has said, "Where is this king that has been born?" And the chief priests and scribes offer up to him, "In Bethlehem of Judea, for so it has been written by the prophet, and you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For from you shall come a ruler who is to shepherd my people Israel." Very, very similar here. Very similar kind of ideas. But this also, as we remember, this ends up leading to the slaughter of the innocents, and Herod, trying to kill every young male child in order to protect his own claim on the throne, and to try and root out that Jewish king, because he wouldn't want the Jewish people to be ruled by the Jewish Messiah, by that kingly person, under his own watch. And so, so we've got this piece coming here, and it is, "O little town of Bethlehem, how still we see thee lie," even though Rob ended that idea for us on Sunday with his sermon. But we've got Jesus here being born in Bethlehem, where Micah had offered up is going to happen. And then shortly after those pieces we were just looking at, where will the Messiah live? When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. And then Matthew, an angel appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, "Get up, take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt. This was to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet. Out of Egypt I have called my son." Now, this is a particular one that we as Christians need to be a little careful of, and we need to, and we need to be careful of, kind of proof texting things, because there really is, this is actually, this could mean a couple of different things to the people of Israel, to the Israelites. This could mean, this could be a way to talk about the people of Israel being called out of Egypt, with the Exodus. This could even be talking about Israel, the individual who was, called out and raised up. So it could have multiple meanings, and in particular, the Jewish faith will look at this as more of a historical reference, as opposed to a predictive reference, a predictive piece. And so this, is very much, kind of God saying, when Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called him. Kind of God remembering what happened with the Exodus. And yet we as Christians look at this and we find that same connection, where it's not simply the people of Israel being called out, it is the Son of God being called out of Egypt, being called son. So it is two very different ways to look at that same prophetic verse. But Matthew makes it very clear for him, this is to fulfill what had been spoken. He is going to make it as clear as can be. And for us to also remember, Matthew is writing to, primarily to a Jewish audience. His readers, his hearers were really, were primarily Jewish people. And so he really does, I think I saw somewhere, he uses twice as many references, Old Testament references, as any other gospel, partly because he's really trying to drive home, or maybe it was specifically talking about messianic pieces, but something along the lines of Matthew using twice as many references as any of the other gospels. But again, he's really trying to drive that point home, to frame and to place Jesus as firmly within that Jewish tradition as he possibly can. And you see it right here as he's saying specifically to fulfill what had been spoken. And then, after that piece, after Jesus returns from Egypt, and where the Messiah then grows up, where Jesus spends most of his older childhood and young adulthood, where is that going to happen? We have Isaiah talking about a shoot coming out from the stump of Jesse, and a branch shall grow out of his roots. And Matthew, offering, he made his home in a town called Nazareth, excuse me, so that what had been spoken through the prophets might be fulfilled. He will be called a Nazarene. And so Jesse, Jesse is very much, Jesse and his sons, very much had some of that same idea, or kind of living in that area of Nazareth, and so you have here being brought out, the shoot growing, or the branch growing out of the roots, coming out of that area, coming out of that town, very, specifically coming out of that town, in order, again, Matthew says, so that the prophets might be fulfilled, and Jesus could be called a Nazarene because of where he grew up. So that's that's looking more at kind of the birth, the early years of Jesus. We're going to skip ahead. We're going to skip ahead now and kind of start to look at how the prophets looked at what would happen to the Messiah, so to speak. And so, kind of some of the pieces, some of the other pieces that we're going to come toward, come towards the end for us as Christians, come at the end of Jesus' life, and how even to and through Jesus' death, he is continuing to live into these different prophetic pieces. The triumphal entry of Jesus, Jesus riding in on a colt, very, very much, that political statement, whether it's a fulfillment of scripture or as a satire, sort of against the political rulers, or probably both, but very much, framed and centered very much right within these what the prophets offered up as well, with Zechariah saying, "Rejoice greatly, O daughter Zion, shout aloud, O Jerusalem. Lo, your king comes to you, triumphant and victorious is he, humble and riding on a donkey, on a colt the foal of a donkey." And then Habakkuk, Habakkuk writes, "The very stones will cry out from the wall, and the plaster respond from the woodwork." And we have here out of Luke, both of those pieces tied together, where the multitude, the crowd, praised God, saying, "Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord, peace in heaven and glory in the highest heaven." Some of the Pharisees in the crowd then said to Jesus, "Teacher, order your disciples to stop." And he answered, "I tell you, if these were silent, the stones would shout out." And so, so you've got this, you have so much, and I mean, specifically with Jesus speaking to the Pharisees, is essentially Jesus saying to the Pharisee, "You know what this references when I say the stones will cry out. You know what I'm talking about. You know that Habakkuk wrote that the stones would cry from the wall at the coming of the Son of Man." And so Luke is really saying Jesus himself is now placing himself as that Messiah. He's really having Jesus claim the ownership of that title, of that position, very, very, very much by using the prophetic, words to talk about himself and to talk about this moment, to talk about his own followers. I had referenced a little bit earlier. I'm hitting the wrong button. Hold on. Okay, so if you read this closely, it is clearly not about the temple cleansing. Apparently I forgot to copy over, I forgot to copy over the next piece. You'll just have to trust me. There were a couple of verses that talk about, that talk about the cleansing of the temple in a sort of roundabout way. These obviously don't talk about it because that is very much the triumphal entry. So there we go. We saved ourselves a few minutes time right there. But even as we continue to get closer and closer to Jesus' death, and even after his death, we are still centered very much within the prophets. Jesus again, Jesus again quoting from the prophets as he's speaking to the, as he is speaking here to the women that are weeping at his feet while he is on the cross. He is quoting that the suffering that he is enduring must happen, that it must fall, and that they must endure through this to the promise that is yet to come. And we've got Hosea talking about the high praises of Avon. The sin of Israel shall be destroyed. Thorn and thistle shall grow up on their altars. They shall say to the mountains, cover us, and to the hills, fall on us. And Jesus saying to the women there at his feet, as he is saying, do not weep for me, weep for others. Then they will begin to say to the mountains, fall on us, and to the hills, cover us, saying that this is something that I must endure, and yet there will be hope to come. All may seem lost. The hills and the mountains are crumbling before you right now. The world as you know it, me, I am leaving you. But there will be hope to come. And then even at the moment of his death, Amos talked about, on that day, says the Lord God, I will make the sun go down at noon and darken the earth in broad daylight. The sun, Joel then continues, the sun shall be turned to darkness and the moon to blood before the great and terrible day of the Lord comes. And then we have that moment that we remember from out of Luke, where it was now about noon, and darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m, while the sun's light failed. That should be an apostrophe S. There wasn't more than one sun at that point. But again, we've got, and we can even hear now some of that, if we remember what we were hearing out of the little apocalypse, earlier tonight, and what Jesus had spoken in that little apocalypse, just a couple of days prior. It is now coming to fruition here as the sky darkens throughout that early part of the afternoon. Amos talked about how dark it would be, how dark it would seem as the earth comes to an end. Joel talks about how dark it is going to seem, as the son of God is going to, will be killed. It is now here, and that we're now seeing that here in real time, so to speak, as we read back in our Gospels. But all is not lost. We as Christians, we are certainly always going to be and always will be people of hope, and we take that. We take that from Hosea. After 2 days, he will revive us. On the 3rd day, he will raise us up that we may live before him. And Jesus said to them, this is now just a little bit before his crucifixion. But Jesus said to them, thus it is written, the Messiah is to suffer and to rise from the dead on the 3rd day. So Jesus is talking about Hosea here. He's interpreting it a little bit differently, as you can read here, where it's, he's talking more about reviving, after reviving the people after 2 days as he is raised up, reviving us with all that his resurrection brings. He's he is talking about that is what will happen on the third day. As I rise from the dead on the third day, the reviving that you have heard about out of Hosea will be accomplished at that time. So you can, so we've got a whole bunch of these. I do, like I said, I know that I used essentially Matthew and Luke. It was more out of, it wasn't ignoring Mark. I wasn't trying to ignore Mark in all of this. I was, the way that I began to approach it, that I ended up approaching it, was more to try and keep it a little bit more consistent, using Matthew a couple times in a row and Luke a couple times in a row in that sort of a way. You will find a whole lot of similarities, especially in those places where Luke and where Matthew are essentially copying Mark. You'll find these exact same references, these exact same words out of there too. So I really was trying to find, kind of keep some consistency from one gospel, within one gospel writer, and try to find some of the places that are a little bit different, that show up just slightly different from each other within the gospels as well. So that is now a whole bunch, but I want to bring you back, and I didn't get that slide. But I want to kind of come back here to this piece, as we kind of think about it a little bit as we prepare to draw our evening to a close. But again, just to remind us that these are the points that we need to think about, that we need to contend with as we look back to the prophets of the Hebrew Bible, the way that they talked about the Messiah, the way they talked about the Son of God, the one who had been promised and was hoped for throughout all of those centuries. We as people of the Christian faith need to think, how closely do these point to Jesus, the individual person? How much for us ended up being, how much error is acceptable, and kind of how do we as Christians end up handling, how do we end up handling some of those various discrepancies that are there throughout the Gospels, really? So I'm gonna, Nancy, I'll leave it up to you if you want to leave those questions up, but really it kind of open it up if anyone has any other comments or questions. I know I threw a lot and talked kind of quick, but have one, please.
I would stop sharing your screen so that we can see each other better.
Yep. There we go.
There we are. Hi, everybody.
We're back to that symmetry again.
Right. So, but those are good questions. Were you, I don't know, upset by any of those slight discrepancies that Jay pointed out for us?
Or even surprised, Kitty?
Right, or surprised, Kitty? You...
Well, I think what struck me was that, there's certain references to the Old Testament, which I think we've all known, but I think there's a whole lot more that we didn't know that I think really is rather astonishing and leads one to think how much of the Gospels were really manipulated in order to get the point across to the audiences. And that's what those questions really bring to mind. Just how much of the story was manipulated to get the story across. And does that really matter? Because I think in essence, does it really matter to what we believe and what we really should be believing? In essence, I don't think it does, but it is something to consider.
Right. Sue, you said no. You were shaking your head that it doesn't matter. Do you want to say a couple words? Oh, here you're
He's muted.
There we go.
I think the general sense is that there's a theme that follows through from the Old Testament to the New Testament that we see, and the precision of the fulfillment of the prophecies is probably not as important as the fact that they were fulfilled.
Very much, very much. It also, for me, one of the things it does is it makes it easier. I mean, kind of seeing things sort of, not that mine was crystal clear necessarily, but just as I was going through, preparing and so many different possibilities, so many different things I could have, picked and chosen. It makes it a whole lot easier to understand why there was doubt. It makes it a whole lot easier why so many, why the entire Jewish faith doesn't recognize Jesus as the Messiah, because there is so much that isn't fulfilled or isn't closely fulfilled in the way that we understand. So much of this is kind of pointing towards pointing towards Jesus and what he did and what he offered. It makes it a lot easier to understand, I think, why there was so much doubt.
Yeah, I think it's Marcus Borg who said, do I believe everything in the Bible? No. Do I believe that the Bible is true? Yes. I think it comes down to that. Yeah, I mean, another example of this contained in the New Testament is Jesus's prediction that the temple will fall. Well, that was actually written by the gospel writers after the temple was destroyed. So, it's really easy to go back and pick up pieces and quotations from existing sources and piece them together to fit your story.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I always remember in the Old Testament course I took at CRCDS, we're talking about the Isaiah stories about Emmanuel. He will come and he'll be named Emmanuel. And and remember in CRCDS, the people in the room are really a mixed bag of theologies. And and he said, do I believe Isaiah knew Jesus was coming? No. Am I going to say that on Christmas Eve? No.
Nope.
But
and
Go ahead.
and
go
and
ahead,
yet,
Erin.
oh,
Go
go ahead.
ahead.
Yeah.
I was just going to say that because the phrasing is so similar and would have been recognizable to people, I was wondering how much of it was to add validity to hearkening back to the previous Old Testament, to the stories, so that it resonated more strongly.
I think that's a huge piece of it. I really do. I think that's a major piece, and that's some of what I was hoping to talk about when I was mentioning Matthew, who of the gospel writers really what is the one writing to sort of the most Jewish audience. I mean, for him to use if I'm remembering it a little bit more clearly, it was of the messianic prophecies that were kind of quoted throughout, like I was using tonight, that Matthew used twice as many as any of the other gospel writers. I think it was something like 60 to 30 is roughly what that ratio was. Very much and I think it was very much as a way to place Jesus as firmly as he could within that tradition, within that tradition of looking for and hoping for the Messiah. And I think that's why you have Jesus quoting. That's another. It's also part of why you have Jesus quoting the prophets talking about the Messiah as well, as a way for him to claim that himself also. Yeah. Nancy, I'm sorry, you were going to say.
Okay, because one of the things I was thinking about last week when we looked at the Pentateuch is, what do the translations have to do? How do all of the different translations that we have influence how we read those Gospels? Did the translator Because often you'll see, if you look at the Oxford annotated, you'll see, well, this word could be this or that or some other thing. There's a whole list of possibilities. And depending on the possibility you choose, could change the meaning of the statement. So, so are the translators putting words in everybody's mouth as well? But to answer that, I'd have to study Greek and Hebrew, so I'm probably not going to go there. But I think it's a good question.
Get back to us on
Yeah,
that, will you, Nancy?
Yeah.
How
Are
long do
you
you
got-
need, Nancy?
Yeah, right. A little time.
You should be able to master both languages in a week.
Yeah, right.
I've got a question about the slide where you had the Old Testament talking about being born of a young woman and the New Testament talking about a virgin. Is that how the Greek translates in the New Testament, virgin, or could it be young woman?
Oh, there's
My understanding is that it is that it is how the Greek translates to virgin, and that it was more in the change happened more in the writing of the Gospels, as opposed to different ways to interpret the Greek later on.
I was thinking too, during some of that, when you were comparing the prophet's words with what Jesus was saying, to that study that was done with the Jesus Symposium and the words that were actually spoken by Jesus, and wondering if some of those words were actually said, according to that study, were said by Jesus, or were those the words that the gospel writer said Jesus said?
Is
yeah,
that the
what
one
I'm saying?
where they all voted? They all
Yeah,
voted
in
on,
other words,
basically
did
sentence
Jesus
by
say all
sentence,
those
phrase by
words that
phrase.
were
Oh,
said by the prophet?
these words are red. These words are pink. These are gray. These are
Exactly,
black.
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
right.
I was wondering which words were those?
Yeah, Mary, who's not here tonight, found an interesting translation of, oh, maybe it was in, hang on one second.
She's Googling.
No, I'm not. No, I'm reading a Bible. It's a New American Standard Bible, which is supposed to be the best Greek translation of,
According to who?
according to Google. Who else?
Good question, Kitty.
The Bible Society or something. But if you look at the Magnificat, for he has had regard for the humble state of his bond slave, indicating Mary. So that word bond slave, I thought that was something to think about. So I think it's an indication that the translations were using, people like the question Tim brought up, is it a virgin or a young woman? I mean, you can read reams and reams of
Sure.
papers on what would be the correct.
Yeah, the reason why I asked the question too is I had heard someone say, and it may have been Nancy talking about this, but that we got the Virgin came down through the ages because Jerome was a really lousy translator of Greek. And when he translated it from Greek into Latin, that's how he translated it.
Just as long as you don't trust Dan Brown's, version of it.
Yeah.
Right.
I guess maybe I could go back and take another look. My understanding was that it wasn't a way to translate the Greek word is virgin, but that the change from young woman to virgin, that particularly happened more, more from the Hebrew Bible into the way it was used into the way Isaiah was used in the Gospels. So.
It is a fascinating study, though.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, and so many of us, this whole, I always think of that first EFM year, sorry, EFM people, but, why do we have to read the Old Testament? Well, it's our scripture, and I think we don't always think about what those references are. I remember a Lenten meditation where there was a psalm that was referencing Moses striking a rock to get water in part of the Exodus, the 40 years in the desert. And but if you didn't remember that Old Testament story, you wouldn't make that connection. And it was the point of the psalm. And so knowing a fair amount about the Old Testament seems important.
And that's how so much of these references are used in the New Testament is, it's just kind of tossed out there. It's just sort of, it's just Jesus, Jesus tosses out, oh yeah, the stones will cry out. Yeah, that's kind of a nice image to think about, just, oh, even creation itself would begin to cry out, for Jesus if the people were silent. But there is so much more weight behind it when you also realize Jesus is telling this to a Pharisee who is going to know exactly that, could probably cite the scripture and verse, the verse and chapter that Jesus is quoting there as referring specifically to that Messiah. I mean, it really brings an additional weight to the stones crying out in that moment. That still sounds nice and still has a great image, but does change and takes on more significance when you, like Nancy was saying, when you recognize where it's coming from, when you're able to do that.
Right.
Back to the virgin, if anybody's interested. The Greek word is Bethula, which is a feminine passive participle of an unused root, meaning to separate a virgin from her privacy. Sometimes a bride, figuratively a city or state, could also mean maid or virgin.
Maid.
So see, we had an expert right here with us.
Yes.
The Blue Letter Bible tells all. One of my favorite tools.
Wow. Well, it's after 8 o'clock and we know we're all going to turn into pumpkins or something. But thank you all for coming. And next week, I will be talking about Psalms and maybe a little bit of Daniel if Jay left me anything.
Oh, I left you plenty, don't worry.
Yeah,
See everyone.
Daniel's really
All right, bye-bye.